The heart of my argument is that Israel's response to the upheavals that have reshaped the region has been profoundly short-sighted and counterproductive. To borrow my colleague Dr. Slugwick's terminology, Israel has in many ways acted in ways that have turned it into its own worst enemy. So let me discuss some of the ways in which Israel responded to the Arab uprising. Israel could have easily viewed the Arab uprisings as an opportunity to revisit long-standing assumptions about the region. And I think some of these assumptions were fundamentally misguided to begin with. First and foremost, that Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood that requires itself to arm itself to the teeth and limit cooperation with its neighbors to a bare minimum. Israel might have also seen the uprisings as an occasion to reset its relations with the Arab countries and the Palestinians on a healthy footing. It might have viewed the uprisings as an occasion to shift its foreign policy towards one that was grounded in democratic values that were at the core of the uprisings, including equality, peaceful accommodation and adjustment of differences with its neighbors, and respect for human rights and international law, the very values that were in keeping with the spirit of the Arab uprisings. However, I think Israel has instead responded in ways that have been very counterproductive, that are harmful to its own vital interests and its own security over the long run. I think Israel very much adopted a glass half empty interpretation of the uprisings, where they should have seen the uprisings as an occasion to restructure its relations with the neighboring Arab countries that were experiencing these uprisings on a foundation of shared democratic values, such as some of those that I mentioned before, like equality and mutual respect. Yet Israel systematically failed to exploit whatever openings did exist to restructure its relations with its neighbors on a healthier footing. Israel tended to exaggerate the dangers that stemmed from the uprisings, rather than grasping whatever opportunities were at hand to improve its position in the region and to reset its relations with its neighbors on a more constructive footing. And also it goes without saying that the way that Israel reacted, the dangers that Israel perceived from the uprisings provided a handy justification for the continuation of hardline policies that only served to deepen Israel's isolation and eventually cast it as a pariah. Israel's short-sighted and counterproductive response to the uprisings was most evident in both its reaction to the Egyptian revolution and in its punitive reaction to the Palestinian Authority's bid for recognition from the UN. Okay, so first of all, let's just take even if we adopt the Israeli premise that the uprisings presented on balance more challenges than opportunities to Israel, at least relative to how Israel defines its goals and interests, whatever opportunities did exist for Israel to improve its position in the region, I think Israel failed to take advantage of. Instead, it tended to act in ways that only undermined its moral authority and tended to alienate former as well as potential allies. So one prime example of this is Israel's response to the Tahrir Square uprisings in Egypt. No doubt Israel was understandably nervous about the downfall of an ally that had served as a reliable caretaker and guardian of Israel's interests in the region. The Mubarak regime cooperated with Israel on many issues that Israel regarded as being of the highest priority. So, for instance, Egypt cooperated with Israel in preserving the Camp David Treaty. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel in containing Iran's ambitions in the region. And Egypt even collaborated in maintaining and enforcing policies that are deeply unpopular among both the Egyptian and Arab people, such as maintaining the embargo on the Gaza Strip. So, Israel was understandably rattled when the Mubarak regime fell. But the question is, did they make good use of the opportunities at hand to improve its position and to win the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people? And I argue that Israel definitely did. What Israel could have done, which would have helped it build political capital with the post-Mubarak regime, and also positioned itself on the right side of history would have been if Israel had unambiguously voiced its support for the Egyptian people at a very early stage. If they had done so, if they had positioned themselves as a champion of democracy, this might have greatly elevated Israel's moral authority in the eyes of the Egyptian people and placed it on the right side of history, and would have very substantially improved its image, which has taken quite a beating in recent years as a result of a variety of policies, most notably Israel's offensive against the Gaza Strip in 2008-2009, which cast Israel in a very aggressive light. However, instead of adopting this kind of response, Israel just dismissed the democratic aspirations of the Egyptian people altogether. And how did Netanyahu and his government interpret the Egyptian uprising? Well, they employed the bogeyman of Iran and radical Islam to thoroughly discredit the democratic potential of these movements. The argument that was made time and time again by Netanyahu and his the other members or the other leading officials of the Israeli government is that even if the revolutionaries were acting in a way that represented a true desire to see democracy develop in Egypt, they would very quickly be outnumbered and outmaneuvered by radical forces, particularly those associated with Iran and its radical proxies. So they said that even if these democratic actors were acting out of a sense of genuine conviction that they genuinely wanted to move Egypt in a more democratic direction, it would only be a matter of time before Iran launched a hostile takeover of the movement. Along with that, Netanyahu and his government tended to rush to judgment about the character of the post-authoritarian regimes and the new political forces. So they basically rushed to judgment when the jury was still out about the intentions and character of the Muslim Brotherhood and other political forces that were rising in post-Mubarak Egypt. They didn't give the Muslim Brotherhood the benefit of the doubt. And instead, they adopted this clash of civilizations framework that essentially erased the critical distinction between moderate and radical strands of political Islam. So the moderates and radicals were basically all lumped together. And most importantly, they didn't even bother to consult the Muslim Brotherhood on its positions with respect to crucial issues, such as its commitment to the Camp David Treaty. If they had probed even a little bit further, they would have discovered the Muslim Brotherhood's essential moderation, and also discovered that the Muslim Brotherhood, as revealed in recent statements, has a healthy respect for Egypt's international commitments. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind something that Israeli policymakers apparently didn't even consider, that the moderate Islamic parties that are poised to play a dominant role in Arab post-authoritarian regimes, including the Muslim Brotherhood, are already showing a far greater inclination to tackle pressing domestic socioeconomic problems than they are in resurrecting old grievances and settling old scores with countries such as Israel. These countries are squarely focused on the domestic scene. They're preoccupied with domestic problems, and they're not going to just latch on to scapegoats such as Israel to deflect attention from these pressing domestic problems. However, Israel tended to adopt the worst-case scenario of thinking about the intentions and character of the post-authoritarian regimes in the region, and I think in the process lost a golden opportunity to win the goodwill of the Arab masses and align itself with the ascending democratic forces. Now, I'd also like to briefly discuss here Israel's response to the Palestinian bid for recognition of an independent state from the UN. I think Israel's response to that initiative was even more short-sighted and counterproductive. And it's important to keep in mind, as Dr. Mekdisi has very well laid out, the Palestinian gambit to appeal to the UN for recognition of an independent Palestinian state along the 1967 line sprang from the same fundamental determination to achieve freedom and dignity that motivated its brethren in neighboring Arab countries. Israel might have responded constructively by simply recognizing the principle of the Palestinian state along the 1967 borders with minor and mutually agreed upon land swaps, and then called for final status negotiations to continue immediately to work out the remaining issues. Not negotiations that drag on without end, which allowed Israel to expand indefinitely in the West Bank, but rather immediate final status negotiations that would work out all of the remaining bones of contention between the two parties. What did Israel do instead, though? Well, with American encouragement, they launched an all-out diplomatic and financial initiative to defeat the bid and stop it in its tracks. Israel adopted a very punitive response to the Palestinian initiative. They reacted in the same way as if the Palestinians had resorted to violence. Okay? Israel conducted a campaign of harsh retaliation against the Palestinians by suspending transfers of desperately needed tax revenue and by intensifying the construction of illegal settlements in the West Bank. I think that this was disastrous because Israel painted itself in a callous and very mean-spirited light by adopting these tactics. By positioning itself against the Palestinians' basic legitimate demands for a right to determine their own future, which, as I said, was an extension of the overarching spirit which animated the uprisings in neighboring Arab countries, Israel only served to isolate itself in the court of regional and international public opinion. Moreover, frustrating Palestinians' basic aspirations to such a fundamental degree only inflames Palestinian hostility towards Israel and risks a violent backlash, which might ultimately culminate in a third intifada, which would only imperil Israel's security over the long run. Now, I know I'm exceeding my allotted time a little bit, so I'd just like to make one last point, and I'm going to give a very expedited presentation of this. I wanted to discuss a little bit the root causes why Israel has failed to turn the opportunities that were presented by the Arab uprising to its advantage. So I'm going to just give a very thumbnail sketch of some of my ideas with respect to the philosophical underpinnings of Israel's aversion to the Arab uprising. I think one reason why Israel has failed to respond in a nimble way to the changes that are roiling the region is that Israel for too long has defined itself as a nation that's an outpost of the West, as opposed to a natural integral part of the region. Except for a brief period following the beginning of the Oslo Accord, Israel has really never attempted to integrate or assimilate itself into the region. Rather, Israel prefers to be, as the biblical verse from the book of Isaiah states, quote, a nation that dwells alone. Israel's connection to the region is skin deep. Although Israel professes to be a democratic state, ironically, Israel has invested fewer efforts and resources into building bridges with the people of the region than perhaps any other state. Its foothold in the region rests exclusively on relationships with various anti-democratic forces, particularly the military, formerly in countries such as Turkey, as well as with autocratic regimes, who are only able to collaborate with Israel in the ways they do because they feel no need to answer to public opinion. So finally, just moving everything forward to the present, Israel now confronts a radically different region. In today's Arab world, especially if these Arab uprisings succeed and culminate in full-fledged democratic regimes, the ordinary citizens will insist on full participation in making both crucial domestic and foreign policy decisions that shape their lives. Now Israel has to deal with governments that reflect the popular will and whose legitimacy rests on the consent of the government, which means that their domestic and foreign policies will reflect the sentiments of their own people to a far greater degree than the strategic requirements of Israel and the U.S. So especially for those Arab states who succeed in making the leap to democracy, they will project the same respect for human rights and democracy in the relations with other states that they practice at home, which means that unlike their authoritarian predecessors, they will insist as a condition for friendship with Israel that Israel abide by fundamental human rights and standards of decency in its treatment of the